The crystal chandelier cast warm light across the Grand Ballroom at the Meridian Hotel as I adjusted my navy blue dress and scanned the room filled with Chicago's corporate elite. What started as a celebration of my father's hard-earned promotion was about to become the most satisfying moment of my professional life. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Richardson, and at 28, I've learned that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage. Tonight, I was watching my father David achieve something he'd worked toward for 25 years at Hartwell Industries. The promotion from plant manager to regional vice president meant everything to him, and seeing his face light up as colleagues congratulated him filled my heart with pride. This was his moment, his victory, and I was genuinely thrilled to be here supporting him. The ballroom buzzed with the energy of successful people celebrating success. Men in expensive suits clustered around the bar, their voices carrying stories of quarterly reports and market expansions. Their wives, dressed in elegant cocktail attire, formed their own circles, discussing charity galas and weekend plans to their lake houses. The entire scene screamed old money, traditional corporate hierarchy, and the kind of networking that happened over aged whiskey and firm handshakes. I had flown in from Austin specifically for this event, rearranging meetings and pushing back product launches, because family comes first. My father had no idea I was coming until I walked through the hotel doors an hour earlier. The look of surprise and joy on his face when he saw me made the last-minute flight completely worth it. He immediately swept me into one of his bear hugs, the kind that reminded me I'd always be his little girl no matter how old I got or what I accomplished. Jessica Chen, my best friend from Northwestern and current COO of my company, had insisted on coming with me. She understood the importance of family milestones, and she also knew how much I valued having someone in my corner during these corporate gatherings. Jessica had a talent for reading rooms and people, skills that had made her invaluable in business, and even more valuable as a friend. The evening began exactly as I expected. Dad introduced me proudly to his colleagues, his chest puffed out with paternal pride as he explained that his daughter had moved to Austin after college. What he didn't mention, what he never mentioned at these work functions, was exactly what I did in Austin. He preferred to keep his family life and professional life separate, which I completely understood and respected. He'd earned his success through his own merit, and he never wanted anyone to think he talked about his family to gain advantage or sympathy. The first sign of how the night would unfold came during cocktail hour. Michael Torres, one of Dad's longtime colleagues who had known me since I was in high school, approached with genuine warmth. He'd watched me grow up through Dad's occasional mentions, and the few times our families had crossed paths at company picnics years ago. "Emma, you look wonderful," Michael said, extending his hand with a sincere smile. "David mentioned you were doing well in Texas. Tell me, what kind of work are you doing down there?" Before I could answer, a voice cut through our conversation. "Torres, we need to discuss those third-quarter projections before the presentation." The interruption came from Linda Hayes, the HR director, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She glanced at me briefly, the kind of dismissive look that categorized me as arm candy, or a +1, then turned her full attention back to Michael. "Of course," Michael said, clearly torn between politeness and professional obligation. "Emma, we'll have to continue this conversation later." I nodded graciously, understanding the dynamics at play. Corporate hierarchy demanded immediate attention to senior requests, and Linda had just exercised her authority. What struck me wasn't the interruption itself, but the complete lack of acknowledgement of my existence after that brief, dismissive glance. The pattern repeated itself throughout the cocktail hour. Stephen Park from finance approached Dad while I stood beside him, launched into a detailed discussion about supply chain optimization, and never once made eye contact with me. When Dad tried to bring me into the conversation by mentioning my background in logistics, Stephen nodded politely, but immediately steered the discussion back to internal company matters, effectively excluding me from a topic I probably knew more about than anyone in the room. Amanda Foster from marketing was even more direct in her dismissal. When Jessica and I found ourselves standing near her group discussing digital transformation challenges, I offered a casual comment about artificial intelligence applications in customer service. Amanda turned, gave me a patronizing smile, and said, "That's nice, dear. Are you in school studying that?" When I mentioned I wasn't in school, she simply turned back to her group without asking what I actually did for work. The most telling moment came when Patricia Williams, a senior VP whom I recognized from industry publications, walked past our small group. I had actually met Patricia 2 years earlier at a tech conference in San Francisco, where she'd been impressed by a presentation I'd given on AI-driven supply chain solutions. She'd even asked for my business card and followed up with a LinkedIn connection. "Patricia," I said warmly as she approached, "it's wonderful to see you again." She paused, clearly trying to place me, her expression polite but blank. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" "Emma Richardson. We connected at the Tech Forward conference in San Francisco. You attended my session on predictive logistics algorithms." Recognition flickered across her face, but before she could respond, Robert Mitchell appeared at her elbow. He was David's new boss, the regional director, who would now oversee Dad's division. Tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, he immediately commanded Patricia's attention. "Patricia, excellent to see you," he said, completely ignoring my presence. "I've been meaning to discuss the Henderson account with you. Do you have a moment?" Patricia glanced at me apologetically, but business was business. "Of course, Robert. Emma, it was lovely seeing you again." She disappeared into conversation with him, leaving me standing alone once more. The evening progressed to dinner, where the seating arrangement told its own story. Dad was positioned at the head table with other honorees and senior executives. I found myself at table 12, surrounded by other family members and plus ones, most of whom seemed more interested in their phones than conversation. The woman next to me, introduced as someone's wife, spent the entire salad course explaining why she preferred their house in Naples to their place in Aspen, as if I should be taking notes for future reference. Jessica leaned over during the main course, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "They have no idea, do they?" I shook my head, cutting into my salmon with perhaps more force than necessary. "Not a clue." "Should we tell them?" "Not yet," I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt. "Let's see how this plays out." The truth was, I was fascinated by the dynamics unfolding around me. These people, successful in their own right, had made assumptions based on my age, my relationship to David, and perhaps my gender. They'd placed me in a neat category that allowed them to dismiss me without consideration. What they didn't know was that the young woman they were ignoring had built something that might very well change their industry. 4 years ago, I had left my consulting job at McKinsey to start Innovate Tech Solutions. The company began in my tiny Austin apartment with nothing but a laptop, a business plan, and an unshakable belief that artificial intelligence could revolutionize supply chain management. We started by solving small logistics problems for local businesses, but our algorithms were so effective that word spread quickly through industry networks. Our breakthrough came when we developed a predictive system that could anticipate supply chain disruptions 3 weeks before they occurred, giving companies unprecedented ability to adjust their operations. Major corporations started reaching out, wanting to license our technology. We'd grown from just me to over 200 employees, with offices in Austin, Denver, and a satellite location in Singapore. Last month, we'd completed our Series C funding round. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Raising $45 million and achieving a company valuation of $50 million. Forbes had featured me on their 30 under 30 inches list in the technology category. Industry publications regularly quoted my insights on artificial intelligence and logistics optimization. I spoke at conferences around the world, consulted for Fortune 500 companies, and had been invited to join the advisory board of the National Technology Council. But tonight, in this ballroom filled with traditional corporate executives, I was simply David Richardson's daughter, who lived in Texas and did something vaguely related to computers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Several of the companies represented in this room were exactly the type of organizations that could benefit most from our solutions. Hartwell Industries itself was struggling with supply chain inefficiencies, that our software could solve within months. I'd actually researched their challenges extensively after Dad mentioned some of the problems his division was facing, and I drafted a preliminary proposal that could save them millions annually. But presenting that proposal required being taken seriously first, and tonight had made it clear that wasn't going to happen through normal channels. The dinner portion of the evening concluded with a presentation honoring the promoted executives. Dad's speech was heartfelt and humble, thanking his family, colleagues, and the company for believing in his potential. He spotted me in the crowd and gave a small wave, his smile radiant with happiness. This was his moment, earned through decades of dedication and hard work, and I felt nothing but pride watching him receive the recognition he deserved. After the formal presentations, the party transitioned into a more relaxed networking phase. The bar reopened, music resumed, and small groups formed throughout the ballroom for continued conversations. This was typically when real business happened at these events, when deals were discussed and relationships were built over drinks and casual conversation. I found myself observing rather than participating, watching the intricate dance of corporate networking. Jessica had struck up a conversation with a group of younger executives, her natural charisma drawing them in as she shared stories about life in Austin. I was content to watch, analyzing the power dynamics and communication patterns that governed these interactions. That's when Robert Mitchell approached the microphone again. The music lowered, and conversations gradually quieted as attention focused on the front of the room. He waited until he had complete silence, clearly enjoying the authority his position commanded. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention once more," he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "I have one more announcement to make this evening, and I believe it will be of significant interest to everyone here." The room fell completely silent. Dad looked surprised, clearly not expecting any additional presentations. I noticed several executives exchanging glances, apparently equally unprepared for whatever Robert was about to announce. "As many of you know," Robert continued, "Hartwell Industries has been exploring strategic partnerships to modernize our supply chain operations. We've been in discussions with several technology companies about implementing artificial intelligence solutions that could revolutionize how we manage our logistics networks." My attention sharpened. This was exactly the type of initiative I'd been hoping Dad's company would pursue, though he'd never mentioned they were actively seeking technology partners. "Tonight, I'm pleased to announce that we've identified our preferred partner for this transformation," Robert said, his smile broadening. "We'll be working with Innovate Tech Solutions, a cutting-edge company based in Austin, Texas, that has developed remarkable predictive algorithms for supply chain optimization." The room erupted in polite applause, though I noticed several confused faces among the crowd. Most of these traditional manufacturing executives probably had limited familiarity with AI companies, especially smaller ones based outside of Silicon Valley. "Innovate Tech has an impressive track record," Robert continued, clearly reading from prepared remarks. "Their client list includes major corporations across multiple industries, and their technology has demonstrated remarkable results in reducing costs and improving efficiency. We're particularly excited about working with their leadership team." He paused, scanning the room with the confidence of someone delivering exciting news. "In fact, I understand that the CEO of Innovate Tech is here with us tonight. I'd love to introduce everyone to the visionary leader who will be transforming our operations." My heart began beating faster as I realized what was happening. Robert was looking for me, but he had no idea who I was. "I believe the CEO is here as someone's guest," he continued, his eyes moving across the crowd. "Could someone point me toward the CEO of Innovate Tech Solutions?" The ballroom fell into an awkward silence as people looked around uncertainly. Robert's confident expression began to falter slightly, as no one immediately responded to his request. Dad looked completely bewildered, clearly having no idea that his company was planning to work with a technology firm, let alone one based in Austin where his daughter lived. Patricia Williams, who had finally remembered our previous meeting, was staring at me with dawning recognition and what appeared to be growing horror at the implications. Jessica, standing across the room, caught my eye and raised her eyebrows in a silent question. I could see her fighting to suppress a smile as she waited to see how I would handle this moment. The silence stretched longer, becoming uncomfortable as Robert's confidence visibly deflated. He'd clearly expected someone to step forward immediately, probably imagining a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who would fit his mental image of a successful CEO. Perhaps the CEO stepped out? Someone suggested helpfully from the crowd. Or maybe they couldn't make it tonight? Offered another voice. Robert's face was beginning to show signs of embarrassment as his big announcement fell flat. He'd obviously planned this as a dramatic moment to showcase his strategic leadership, but without the CEO present to acknowledge, the impact was completely lost. That's when I decided it was time to end his confusion. I took a breath, straightened my shoulders, and began walking toward the front of the room. The click of my heels on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silent ballroom as conversations stopped and heads turned to follow my movement. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I'm right here." The expression on Robert Mitchell's face as realization dawned was something I would remember for the rest of my life. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Robert Mitchell's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if his brain was struggling to process what he'd just heard. His eyes swept over me, taking in my youthful appearance, my simple navy dress, the fact that I was standing among the family members rather than the executives. I could practically see him trying to reconcile his expectations with reality. "I'm sorry, did you say you're here?" he managed, his voice carrying a note of confusion that bordered on disbelief. "I did," I replied calmly, continuing my walk toward the front of the room. Every step felt deliberate, measured. The clicking of my heels against the marble floor seemed to echo in the silence. Emma Richardson, CEO, and founder of Innovate Tech Solutions. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began whispering to each other. I could hear fragments of conversations, expressions of surprise and confusion. Someone said, "That's David's daughter." Another voice asked, "Did she say CEO?" The energy in the room had shifted completely, transforming from polite corporate networking into something much more electric. Dad's face was a study in shock and pride wrestling for dominance. His mouth hung open as he stared at me, clearly having no idea that his little girl was the CEO of the company his employer wanted to partner with. I caught his eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. This wasn't about embarrassing him or overshadowing his moment. This was about claiming the space I'd earned. Robert recovered his composure with visible effort, straightening his tie and forcing what I assumed was meant to be a welcoming smile. "Miss Richardson," he said, the formality in his voice unmistakably different from the casual dismissal I'd experienced all evening. "This is quite unexpected. When we were told the CEO would be attending tonight's event, we assumed—" He trailed off, apparently realizing that finishing that sentence wouldn't reflect well on him. I decided to help him out, though not in the way he probably hoped. "You assumed it would be someone who looked different," I said, my tone pleasant but direct. "Someone older, perhaps, someone male, someone who would immediately command attention in a room like this." The murmur from the crowd grew louder. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed more than a few executives avoiding eye contact. Patricia Williams was staring at me with what appeared to be a mixture of admiration and horror, probably remembering every interaction we'd had earlier in the evening. "That's not what I meant," Robert said quickly, though his flustered expression suggested it was exactly what he meant. "We simply weren't expecting someone so young to have achieved such remarkable success." "Age is relative in the technology sector," I replied. Mark Zuckerberg was 19 when he founded Facebook. I was 24 when I started Innovate Tech. Sometimes fresh perspectives drive the most innovative solutions. Jessica had moved closer during this exchange, positioning herself where I could see her supportive smile. She knew how significant this moment was, not just professionally but personally. We'd talked countless times about the challenges of being young women in leadership positions, about the constant need to prove ourselves in rooms full of people who looked nothing like us. "Of course," Robert said, his recovery gaining momentum. "We've been incredibly impressed with your company's track record. The results you've achieved for other organizations are exactly what Hartwell Industries needs to modernize our operations." This was the moment where I could have simply accepted his pivot, allowed him to save face, and move forward with the business relationship. The diplomatic approach would have been to graciously acknowledge his words and begin discussing the partnership potential. But something about the evening, about being ignored and dismissed for hours, made me choose a different path. I'm curious, I said, glancing around the room before returning my attention to Robert. When exactly did Hartwell Industries decide to pursue this partnership? Because this is the first I'm hearing about it. Robert's confident expression faltered. I'm sorry, what do you mean? I mean that while I appreciate your enthusiasm about working with Innovate Tech, we haven't actually entered into any agreement with your company. We haven't had preliminary discussions, we haven't reviewed your operational challenges, and we certainly haven't committed to any partnership. The room had gone completely quiet again. Dad looked confused, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Several executives were exchanging worried glances, apparently realizing that their regional director might have significantly overstated the situation. But our technology team assured me that Innovate Tech was committed to working with us, Robert said, his voice becoming defensive. They said the deal was practically finalized. I think there might be some miscommunication somewhere, I replied diplomatically. Perhaps your team has been in discussions with one of our competitors. There are several AI companies working in supply chain optimization. It's possible someone got their wires crossed. What I didn't say, but what was becoming increasingly clear, was that Robert had likely made assumptions about securing our partnership without actually going through proper channels. He'd probably heard that I would be at the event tonight and decided to make a grand announcement without confirming the details. It was the kind of mistake that happened when executives got excited about looking innovative without doing their homework. Michael Torres, who had tried to engage me in conversation earlier, stepped forward slightly. Emma, I had no idea about your company's focus when we spoke earlier. Supply chain optimization is exactly what our division has been struggling with. David mentioned some of our challenges, but I didn't realize you might have solutions. That's because no one asked, I said simply, looking directly at Robert. I've been here all evening, surrounded by people discussing exactly the kinds of problems my company solves. But instead of engaging in conversation, everyone assumed I was just someone's plus one. The truth of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. Several people had the grace to look embarrassed, remembering their earlier dismissive interactions with me. Linda Hayes, who had interrupted my conversation with Michael, was studying her champagne glass with intense focus. Stephen Park, who had excluded me from the supply chain discussion, was shifting his weight uncomfortably. Well, Robert said, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, now that we know who you are, perhaps we could arrange a proper meeting to discuss potential collaboration. Perhaps, I said, my tone non-committal. Though I have to say, tonight has been quite educational about Hartwell's corporate culture. The way a company treats people before they know who they are says a lot about their values and leadership style. Dad stepped forward then, his paternal instincts overriding his professional caution. Emma, sweetheart, I had no idea about any of this. If I had known your company was involved. It's not your fault, Dad, I said warmly, wanting to make sure he understood this wasn't about him. You've always encouraged me to build my own success, to earn recognition through my work rather than family connections. Tonight just proved why that approach is so important. Robert was clearly struggling with how to respond. On one hand, he needed to maintain his authority and credibility with his colleagues and subordinates. On the other hand, he'd just made a significant public error and was now dealing with someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by his position or his attempts at damage control. Miss Richardson, he said, his tone becoming more formal, I hope you'll consider that first impressions can sometimes be misleading. Hartwell Industries is committed to innovation and partnership with forward-thinking companies like yours. First impressions are indeed important, I agreed. And tonight your company's first impression was that a young woman at a corporate event must be someone's daughter, someone's date, or someone's wife, but certainly not someone worth engaging in professional conversation. The accusation was direct enough that several people in the crowd reacted visibly. Some nodded in recognition of the truth, others looked uncomfortable with having their behavior called out so explicitly. Jessica was fighting to hide a proud smile, knowing how long I'd been waiting for an opportunity to address this kind of treatment directly. That's a serious allegation, Robert said, his voice cooling noticeably. It's an accurate observation, I replied calmly. I spent the entire cocktail hour and dinner listening to conversations about logistics challenges, supply chain inefficiencies, and technology modernization. I attempted several times to contribute to these discussions, only to be dismissed or ignored. The irony is that my company has solutions for every single problem I heard discussed tonight. Patricia Williams cleared her throat, drawing attention to herself. Emma, I owe you an apology. When we spoke earlier, I should have remembered our previous meeting immediately. You made quite an impression at the Tech Forward conference. Thank you, Patricia, I said, appreciating her willingness to acknowledge the situation publicly, though I think the issue goes beyond individual memory lapses. It's about systemic assumptions and unconscious biases that affect how we interact with people in professional settings. The conversation was moving into territory that made many of the executives visibly uncomfortable. These were successful people who prided themselves on their professional judgment and leadership skills. Being told that they'd collectively failed to recognize talent that was literally standing in front of them was clearly challenging for some of them to accept. Robert, meanwhile, was clearly calculating his options. He'd made a public announcement about a partnership that didn't exist, been corrected by the CEO of the company in question, and was now being lectured about unconscious bias in front of his colleagues and subordinates. His pride was clearly stinging, but he also needed to consider the business implications of this situation. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting, he suggested. There's no need to air business discussions in front of the entire party. Actually, I think transparency is exactly what's needed here, I replied. Everyone in this room heard your announcement about our supposed partnership. They deserve to hear the clarification as well. Dad moved closer to me, his presence offering silent support. I could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about a business misunderstanding. This was about respect, recognition, and the way power dynamics played out in corporate environments. Emma, he said quietly, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I had no idea the scope of your success. I know, Dad, I replied, squeezing his arm affectionately. You raised me to be independent and to earn my own way. Tonight is proof that your approach worked. The exchange between Dad and me seemed to shift something in the room's energy. People were beginning to see this not just as a business conflict, but as a family moment, a father discovering the extent of his daughter's achievements. Several faces in the crowd showed expressions of understanding and even admiration. But Robert wasn't ready to concede the conversation. Miss Richardson, while I appreciate your perspective, I think you might be overreacting to what were simply social misunderstandings. Business networking can be complex, and people don't always engage with everyone at these events. You're right, I said, my voice remaining calm despite his dismissive tone. Business networking is complex. That's why successful executives learn to recognize talent and opportunity, regardless of how it's packaged. Tonight, your organization failed that test spectacularly. The words hit their mark. Several executives exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to question Robert's judgment, both in terms of the false partnership announcement and his handling of the current situation. Leadership credibility was built on competence and good judgment, and both were being called into question. Jessica chose that moment to step forward, introducing herself with the kind of professional confidence that commanded immediate attention. I'm Jessica Chen, COO of Innovate Tech Solutions, she said, extending her hand to Robert. I've been observing tonight's interactions with great interest. Robert shook her hand automatically, clearly not sure where this new development was heading. Emma and I have been discussing Hartwell Industries' potential as a client for several months, Jessica continued, her tone professional but pointed. We've done preliminary research on your operational challenges and identified several areas where our technology could provide significant value. However, after tonight's demonstration of your company culture, we'll need to carefully evaluate whether there's a good cultural fit for a long-term partnership. The implication was clear. Innovate Tech was now in the position of evaluating Hartwell, rather than the other way around. Robert's face showed that he understood the reversal perfectly. I think we're all getting ahead of ourselves here, he said, attempting to regain control. Let's not let social misunderstandings interfere with potential business opportunities. Social interactions are business, I replied firmly. The way people treat each other in professional settings reflects their values, their judgment, and their leadership capabilities. These aren't separate issues. The crowd around us had grown as more people realized something significant was happening. The party had effectively stopped, with most attendees now focused on our conversation. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, probably for photos or videos that would capture this moment. Dad stepped closer to Robert, his expression serious. "Bob, I think Emma has a point here. I've watched her work since she was a kid, and I've never seen anyone with her combination of intelligence and integrity. If she says there's a problem with how she was treated tonight, then there's a problem." The fact that Dad was publicly supporting me over his new boss was significant. David Richardson had spent 25 years building his career at Hartwell Industries, and he was risking some of that political capital to stand with his daughter. The gesture meant everything to me, and I could see it registered with others in the room as well. Robert's expression tightened as he realized he was losing support from multiple directions. "David, I appreciate your family loyalty, but business decisions need to be based on business considerations, not personal relationships." "Exactly," I interjected. "Business decisions should be based on competence, track record, and potential value creation. All of which you ignored tonight because you made assumptions based on demographics rather than qualifications." The accusation hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Robert was now faced with either acknowledging his mistake or doubling down on a position that was becoming increasingly untenable. "Miss Richardson," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you're being unnecessarily confrontational about what amounts to a simple misunderstanding. And I think you're being unnecessarily defensive about behavior that speaks to deeper leadership issues," I replied calmly. The standoff was interrupted by Patricia Williams stepping forward again. "Robert, perhaps we should consider that Emma has raised some valid points about how we engage with potential partners and their representatives. These are exactly the kinds of insights that could help us improve our business development processes." Her intervention was clearly an attempt to de-escalate the situation, while also subtly supporting my position. As a senior VP, her opinion carried significant weight, and her willingness to challenge Robert publicly was notable. But Robert seemed determined to maintain his stance. "Patricia, I appreciate your perspective, but I don't think we need to turn a networking event into a seminar on corporate sensitivity training." The dismissive comment was a mistake. Several people in the crowd reacted negatively to his characterization of the discussion, and I could see faces that suggested he was losing more support with each defensive response. "Actually," said a new voice from the crowd, "I think this conversation is exactly what corporate America needs more of." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Amanda Foster from marketing, the same woman who had earlier asked if I was in school. Her face showed a mixture of embarrassment and determination as she continued. "I was one of the people who dismissed Emma earlier tonight," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I made assumptions based on her age and her presence at a family event. I was wrong, and I'm grateful she's calling attention to these patterns." Her public acknowledgement seemed to give others permission to reflect on their own behavior. Michael Torres nodded in agreement, and even Linda Hayes from HR looked thoughtful rather than defensive. Robert, however, was clearly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. "This is exactly the kind of overanalysis that prevents productive business relationships," he said. "Sometimes people don't connect at networking events. It doesn't have to be turned into a social justice issue." The phrase, social justice issue, landed badly with much of the crowd. In a room full of corporate executives who prided themselves on progressive leadership and inclusive business practices, Robert's dismissive characterization sounded tone-deaf and outdated. "With respect," I said, my voice remaining steady, "recognizing talent and treating people with professional courtesy isn't social justice. It's basic business competence." The response drew nods of agreement from around the room, and I could see Robert realizing that he was increasingly isolated in his position. His attempts to minimize the situation were backfiring, making him appear defensive and out of touch rather than authoritative and reasonable. Jessica stepped closer to me, her presence offering both support and strategic backup. "Emma, perhaps we should wrap up this conversation. We have an early flight tomorrow, and I think we've made our points clear." Her suggestion was perfectly timed, offering me an opportunity to end the discussion on my terms, rather than allowing it to drag on indefinitely. Sometimes the most powerful move was knowing when to stop talking and let your words settle. "You're right," I said, then turned to address the room generally. I want to thank everyone for an enlightening evening. It's been educational in ways I didn't expect. My eyes found Dad's face in the crowd, and I smiled warmly at him. Dad, congratulations again on your promotion. You've earned every bit of recognition you received tonight, and I'm incredibly proud of you. The shift back to the original purpose of the evening was deliberate, reminding everyone that this had started as a celebration of my father's achievements. Whatever conflicts had emerged, I wasn't going to let them overshadow his moment. Thank you, sweetheart, Dad replied, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of you too. More than you know. The exchange between us seemed to provide a natural conclusion to the more contentious part of the conversation. People began to relax slightly, sensing that the immediate conflict was winding down. But Robert apparently wasn't ready to let me have the last word. Miss Richardson, I hope that when emotions have cooled, you'll reconsider the potential benefits of working with Hartwell Industries. We remain interested in exploring a partnership with your company. I paused for a moment, considering my response carefully. The room was watching, waiting to see how I would handle his final attempt to assert some form of authority over the situation. Mr. Mitchell, I said finally, if Hartwell Industries is genuinely interested in partnering with Innovate Tech, you know how to reach us through proper business channels. We'll evaluate any proposal based on its merits and the professionalism of the process. The response was polite, but made it clear that I wouldn't be making business decisions based on personal dynamics or pressure applied in social settings. If he wanted to pursue a partnership, he would need to do it properly, through formal business development processes. Of course, he replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with my answer. Jessica and I began moving toward the exit, our departure signaling a clear end to the evening's drama. But as we walked away, I could hear conversations resuming throughout the ballroom, animated discussions about what had just happened and what it meant. The most satisfying sound was Dad's voice, already beginning to tell someone about his daughter's company and her achievements. The pride in his tone made everything worthwhile. As we reached the ballroom exit, Patricia Williams caught up with us. Emma, I wanted to apologize again for earlier. But more than that, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak at our next board meeting about innovation in supply chain management. After tonight, I think we have a lot to learn. I smiled at her, appreciating both the apology and the professional opportunity. I'd be happy to discuss that, Patricia. Have your team reach out to schedule something. Jessica and I stepped into the hotel lobby, the noise of the party fading behind us. The evening air felt cool and refreshing after the intensity of the ballroom. So, Jessica said as we waited for our car, how does it feel to blow up a corporate networking event? I laughed, feeling the tension finally leaving my shoulders. Honestly, pretty satisfying, though I hope Dad doesn't get any blowback from his new boss. Your dad held his own in there, Jessica replied. He stood up for you when it mattered. Robert Mitchell is the one who should be worried about blowback. As our car pulled up, I reflected on the evening's events. What had started as a simple family celebration had turned into something much more significant. I'd been underestimated, dismissed, and ignored. But I'd also found my voice and used it to challenge assumptions that needed challenging. The real test would be what happened next. How the ripple effects of tonight's conversation would play out in the days and weeks to come. But for now, I was content knowing that I'd stood up for myself and for every other young woman who had ever been overlooked in a room full of powerful people. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or strategies, but with truth and the courage to speak it when it matters most. The drive back to my hotel gave me time to process what had just happened, but sleep proved elusive that night. I found myself staring at the ceiling of my suite at the peninsula, replaying the evening's events and considering their implications. What most people in that ballroom didn't realize was that tonight's confrontation had been building for years, not just hours. My journey to founding Innovate Tech hadn't begun with a sudden entrepreneurial inspiration. It started during my junior year at Northwestern, when I was working as a research assistant for Professor Sarah Martinez in the Industrial Engineering Department. Dr. Martinez was pioneering work in predictive analytics for supply chain management, and I had thrown myself into her research with the kind of obsessive focus that my friends found both admirable and slightly concerning. The breakthrough came during winter break of my senior year. I was working alone in the lab, cross-referencing weather data with shipping delays across the Midwest transportation network, when I noticed a pattern that everyone else had missed. Storm systems weren't just causing immediate disruptions. They were creating cascade effects that rippled through supply chains for weeks after the weather had cleared. More importantly, these cascade effects followed predictable mathematical patterns that could be modeled and anticipated. I spent the next 6 months developing algorithms that could predict these secondary and tertiary effects with remarkable accuracy. My senior thesis demonstrated that companies could reduce supply chain disruptions by up to 60% if they had access to this kind of predictive modeling. Dr. Martinez was so impressed that she encouraged me to present my findings at the National Supply Chain Conference in Chicago. That presentation changed everything. I was 22 years old, standing in front of an audience of seasoned logistics professionals and supply chain executives, explaining how artificial intelligence could revolutionize their industry. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Business cards poured in from companies wanting to license my algorithms, investment firms offering funding, and headhunters promising 6-figure salaries at consulting firms. McKinsey & Company offered me a position in their operations practice straight out of college, with a starting salary that seemed impossibly generous for someone who had never worked in corporate America. I accepted immediately, thinking I was living a fairy tale. For 2 years, I threw myself into consulting work, helping Fortune 500 companies optimize their operations and implement new technologies. But the fairy tale had a dark side that became apparent gradually. Despite my technical expertise and the value I brought to client engagements, I found myself consistently overlooked for leadership roles and high-visibility projects. Partners would praise my analytical skills in private, then assign presentation duties to male colleagues who had contributed less to the actual work. Clients would direct questions to the men in the room, even when I was the technical lead on their projects. The breaking point came during a presentation to the executive team at a major automotive manufacturer. I had spent months developing a comprehensive supply chain optimization strategy that would save the company over $50 million annually. But when it came time to present our recommendations, the partner on the engagement asked my male colleague to deliver the presentation while I sat in the back taking notes. After the presentation, which went flawlessly, the client's CEO approached my colleague to offer congratulations on the brilliant strategy. When my colleague attempted to redirect credit to me, the CEO smiled politely and said, "I'm sure she contributed valuable research support." Research support? For work that was entirely my creation. That night, I sat in my Chicago apartment staring at a job offer from a startup in Silicon Valley. The salary was lower than what McKinsey was paying, but the opportunity to build something from scratch was appealing. More importantly, the startup's founders had seen my presentation at the supply chain conference and wanted me specifically for my technical expertise, not as support staff for someone else's vision. I turned down the Silicon Valley offer, but it planted a seed that continued growing over the following months. Why was I helping other people build their companies when I could build my own? Why was I accepting other people's limitations on my potential when I could create my own opportunities? The decision to leave McKinsey and start Innovate Tech wasn't driven by a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of dozens of smaller moments when I realized I was capable of more than the role I'd been assigned. The final catalyst came when I discovered that McKinsey was charging clients over $2 million for implementations of strategies I had developed, while I was earning a fraction of that value and receiving none of the recognition. I gave my notice on a Friday afternoon in March 4 years ago. The partner I reported to seemed genuinely surprised, as if he couldn't understand why someone would leave such a prestigious position. When I explained that I was starting my own company, he smiled condescendingly and said, "Well, if the entrepreneurship thing doesn't work out, you'll always have a place here in a research role." A research role. After 2 years of developing strategies that generated hundreds of millions in value for clients, he saw me as someone who could do research for other people's ideas. I left McKinsey that day with $23,000 in savings, a business plan I had been developing for months, and an unshakable belief that I could build something better than anything I could ever build for someone else. The first year of Innovate Tech was brutal. I worked 18-hour days from my studio apartment in Austin, surviving on coffee and takeout, while building the foundational technology that would become our core platform. I had moved to Austin because the cost of living was lower than Chicago or Silicon Valley, and because the University of Texas had a strong computer science program that could provide talent as the company grew. My first client was a small logistics company in Houston that was struggling with inventory management. The owner, Maria Santos, had heard about my work through a mutual connection and was desperate enough to try an unproven technology from a one-person startup. I charged her $5,000 to implement a basic version of my predictive algorithms, and within 3 months, her company had reduced inventory costs by 30% while improving delivery times. Maria became my first reference client, and word spread through the tight-knit logistics community in Texas. Small and medium-sized companies began reaching out, drawn by the promise of results and the affordable pricing that a startup could offer. Each implementation taught me something new about real-world applications of my technology, allowing me to refine and improve the algorithms continuously. By the end of the first year, Innovate Tech had 12 clients and 2 employees. Sarah Kim, a brilliant programmer I had met at a tech meetup in Austin, joined as our first developer. Marcus Rodriguez, a business development professional with deep connections in the logistics industry, became our head of sales. We moved from my apartment to a small office space in East Austin, complete with a coffee machine and a ping-pong table that we never had time to use. The second year brought our first major breakthrough. A mid-sized manufacturing company in Dallas implemented our technology and achieved such dramatic improvements that their parent company, a Fortune 500 corporation, requested a meeting with us. The parent company engagement led to our first 7-figure contract and established Innovate Tech as a serious player in the enterprise market. That success opened doors that had previously been closed. Investment firms that had ignored my initial outreach began calling regularly. Industry publications wanted interviews. Conference organizers invited me to speak at major events. The same McKinsey partner, who had offered me a research role, sent a LinkedIn message congratulating me on the company's success and suggesting we explore partnership opportunities. But growth brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. Scaling a technology company required skills and resources far beyond algorithm development. We needed experienced executives, sophisticated marketing capabilities, robust customer support systems, and operational infrastructure that could handle enterprise-level clients. The decision to raise institutional funding was difficult, but necessary. Venture capital firms were interested in our technology and our growth trajectory, but many investors struggled with the same biases I had encountered throughout my career. Partners would ask detailed questions about my technical qualifications, then suggest bringing in an experienced CEO to guide the company through its next phase of growth. The implication was always the same. I was smart enough to develop the technology, but not experienced enough to lead a growing company. The fact that I had already been leading the company successfully for 2 years somehow didn't factor into their assessment. I eventually found the right investors, a firm called Austin Ventures that specialized in Texas-based technology companies. The managing partner, Catherine Lowe, was a former entrepreneur herself who had faced similar challenges building her own company. She understood both the technology and the market opportunity, but more importantly, she understood the importance of backing the founder who had created the vision. The Series A funding round raised $12 million and allowed us to accelerate our growth significantly. We expanded our development team, hired experienced sales and marketing professionals, and began targeting larger enterprise clients. Within 18 months, we had grown from 15 employees to over 70, with offices in Austin and a satellite location in Dallas. The Series B round, led by a Silicon Valley firm with deep experience in artificial intelligence companies, raised $28 million and validated our technology at the highest levels of the venture capital community. Industry analysts began including Innovate Tech in reports about the most promising AI companies outside of Silicon Valley. Forbes featured me in an article about young entrepreneurs who were reshaping traditional industries. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, my former professor at Northwestern, invited me to speak at the university's annual entrepreneurship conference. Standing in the same lecture hall where I had first learned about supply chain optimization, addressing an audience of students who reminded me of my younger self, I felt the full weight of how far I had traveled. The journey from graduate student to CEO had been marked by countless moments of doubt and determination. Every investor meeting where I had to prove I belonged in the room. Every client presentation where I had to demonstrate technical credibility before anyone would listen to business strategy. Every industry conference where I was introduced as one of the few women in this space, rather than simply as an expert in my field. Tonight's confrontation with Robert Mitchell and the Hartwell Industries executives was just the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for years. The difference was that now I had the track record, the resources, and the confidence to call out behavior that I might have tolerated earlier in my career. Lying in my hotel bed, watching the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, I thought about the phone calls that would likely come tomorrow. Robert would probably attempt some form of damage control, perhaps reaching out through intermediaries to explore whether a business relationship was still possible. Other executives from tonight's event might call to apologize or to explore partnerships with Innovate Tech, but the most important call would be from Dad. He would want to understand what had happened, to process the reality that his daughter had built something significant while he was focused on his own career challenges. I knew he was proud, but I also knew he was probably worried about the implications for his own position at Hartwell Industries. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica, who was staying at a different hotel. Can't sleep either? Tonight was amazing, but I keep thinking about what comes next. I smiled at her message, grateful for a friend who understood both the satisfaction and the complexity of what had occurred. Same here. Coffee tomorrow before our flight? We need to talk strategy. Absolutely. This isn't over, is it? She was right, of course. Tonight had been a single battle in a much larger war, one that extended far beyond my personal experience or even my company's success. The issues we had confronted in that ballroom affected countless women in corporate America, from entry-level employees to senior executives who still had to prove themselves in ways that their male counterparts never experienced. The text messages continued through the early morning hours, as Jessica and I discussed the potential implications of tonight's events. By dawn, we had outlined a plan that extended far beyond damage control or business development. We were going to use this moment as a catalyst for something bigger. The first element of our strategy was media engagement. The story of what had happened at Hartwell Industries' promotion party was exactly the kind of narrative that business journalists loved. A successful young entrepreneur confronting unconscious bias in corporate America. If we told the story carefully, focusing on the broader implications rather than personal grievances, it could spark important conversations about inclusion and leadership in traditional industries. The second element was industry engagement. Innovate Tech had reached a level of success that gave us credibility and influence within the supply chain and logistics community. We could use that platform to advocate for more inclusive business practices, not just in hiring and promotion decisions, but in fundamental approaches to networking, partnership development, and stakeholder engagement. The third element was the most ambitious. We wanted to create a formal program that would help other young women navigate similar challenges in their own careers. Too many talented people were being overlooked or underestimated because they didn't fit traditional expectations of what leadership looked like. If we could provide mentoring, networking opportunities, and strategic guidance, we might be able to change some of those outcomes. By the time Jessica and I met for coffee at 7 a.m., we had transformed a difficult evening into the foundation for a broader initiative. The conversation with Robert Mitchell had been just the beginning, not the end of the story. So we're really doing this? Jessica asked as we settled into a corner table at the hotel's restaurant. We're really doing this, I confirmed. But we need to be smart about it. This can't be about revenge or personal vindication. It has to be about creating positive change. Agreed. And we need to make sure your dad doesn't get caught in the crossfire. Dad had texted me at 6 a.m. asking if we could have breakfast before my flight back to Austin. His message was brief but filled with subtext. Proud of you. Need to talk about what happens next. When he arrived at the restaurant 30 minutes later, I could see the mixture of pride and concern in his expression. He hugged me tightly, then sat down with the serious demeanor of someone who had spent the night thinking through complex implications. First things first, he said without preamble, I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. I had no idea about the scope of Innovate Tech's success, and I should have. Dad, you've always supported my independence. You taught me to build my own path rather than relying on family connections. Last night proved that approach was right. Maybe, but I also should have been more aware of what you were dealing with in terms of how people treat you professionally. I've been in corporate America for 25 years, and I've seen how women get overlooked, but I didn't connect that to your experience. Jessica leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Richardson, that's actually part of what we want to address moving forward. Even well-intentioned people often don't recognize the patterns until they're pointed out explicitly. Dad nodded slowly. What happened with Robert last night, that wasn't an accident. He's always been someone who makes quick judgments about people based on surface impressions. I've seen him dismiss ideas from younger employees, even when those ideas turned out to be valuable. What's his position like within the company? I asked. Is he secure enough to weather criticism, or is this going to create problems for him? That's the interesting question, Dad replied. Robert was brought in from outside 6 months ago to modernize our operations and improve our technology adoption. The board specifically hired him because they felt the company was falling behind competitors in terms of innovation. Jessica and I exchanged glances. So his credibility depends on successfully implementing technology partnerships and demonstrating progressive leadership. Exactly, which means last night probably created more problems for him than for anyone else. The implications were significant. Robert's false announcement about the Innovate Tech partnership wasn't just embarrassing. It called into question his competence and judgment. His defensive response to being corrected suggested someone who was more concerned with protecting his ego than acknowledging mistakes and moving forward constructively. There's something else, Dad continued. I've heard rumors that the board is already questioning some of Robert's decisions. He's been pushing expensive consulting contracts with firms that haven't delivered measurable results. Meanwhile, our actual operational problems keep getting worse. What kind of operational problems? Jessica asked. Supply chain inefficiencies, inventory management issues, quality control challenges. Exactly the kinds of problems that Emma's company specializes in solving. I sipped my coffee, considering the possibilities. Dad, hypothetically, if Innovate Tech were to provide a proposal for addressing Hartwell's operational challenges, who would be the decision maker? It would go through Robert initially, but the board would have final approval for any major technology investment. And after last night, I suspect the board might be more inclined to evaluate proposals independently rather than just accepting Robert's recommendations. The conversation continued for another hour, as we explored the various ways that the previous evening's events might unfold. By the time Dad left for work and Jessica and I headed to the airport, we had a clearer understanding of both the opportunities and the risks ahead. The flight back to Austin gave us additional time to refine our strategy. Jessica had already begun reaching out to her media contacts, gauging interest in a story about unconscious bias in corporate networking. The initial responses were encouraging. Several business journalists were interested in exploring the broader implications of what had happened at the Hartwell event. Meanwhile, I was reviewing Innovate Tech's capacity for taking on new enterprise clients. We had deliberately kept our client roster manageable to ensure high-quality service delivery, but we had the technical capability and operational infrastructure to handle additional large-scale implementations. The question wasn't whether we could help Hartwell Industries solve their operational challenges. The question was whether we wanted to engage with a company whose leadership had demonstrated such problematic judgment and behavior. As our plane descended into Austin, I found myself thinking about the young woman who had left McKinsey 4 years earlier with nothing but a business plan and a determination to prove herself. That woman had been driven primarily by personal ambition and the desire to escape environments where she felt undervalued. The woman returning to Austin today had different motivations. Success had given me the luxury of choosing my battles and the responsibility of fighting them well. Tonight's confrontation hadn't been about personal vindication. It had been about using a moment of conflict to illuminate broader issues that affected countless other people. The real test would be what happened next, how we transformed a single evening's drama into lasting positive change. That would require strategic thinking, careful execution, and the kind of long-term vision that extended far beyond any individual business deal or partnership opportunity. But as I looked out the airplane window at the Austin skyline, I felt confident that we were ready for whatever came next. We had built something significant, earned the right to be heard, and developed the skills to navigate complex challenges. Most importantly, we had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply to prove the estimates wrong. 3 weeks after the Hartwell Industries promotion party, I was sitting in my corner office overlooking downtown Austin when my assistant knocked on the door with an expression that suggested something significant was happening. Sarah had been with Innovate Tech for 18 months, and I had learned to read her facial expressions like a barometer for the importance of whatever news she was bringing. "Emma, you have a call on line 2, she said, her voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement. "It's Catherine Morrison from the Wall Street Journal. She says it's about the Hartwell Industries story." I had been expecting this call, though I hadn't anticipated it would come through such a prominent publication. Over the past 3 weeks, word about what had happened at Dad's promotion party had spread through business networks with the kind of velocity that only accompanied stories people found both surprising and significant. Jessica's careful outreach to business journalists had apparently reached exactly the right people. "Put her through," I said, settling back in my chair and taking a breath to center myself. This conversation would likely determine how our story was told to a much broader audience. "Ms. Richardson, thank you for taking my call," Catherine said, her voice professional but warm. "I'm working on a piece about unconscious bias in corporate networking, and several sources have mentioned your recent experience at a Hartwell Industries event. Would you be willing to share your perspective?" For the next 45 minutes, I walked Catherine through the events of that evening, being careful to focus on the broader patterns rather than personal grievances. I explained how my identity as CEO of Innovate Tech had been completely overlooked, despite multiple opportunities for meaningful professional engagement. I described the assumptions that led Robert Mitchell to announce a partnership that didn't exist, and the defensive responses when those assumptions were challenged. "What strikes me most about your story," Catherine said toward the end of our conversation, "is how your calm response seemed to unsettle people more than anger would have. Was that intentional?" "Absolutely," I replied. "When you respond to dismissive treatment with emotion, it confirms people's assumptions about your lack of professionalism or suitability for leadership roles. But when you respond with facts and composure, it forces them to confront the validity of their own behavior." "And what's happened since that evening? Have you heard from Hartwell Industries?" That was the question I had been anticipating. We've received several inquiries from Hartwell executives about potential partnerships, though none through official channels. More significantly, we've heard from dozens of other companies whose leadership attended that event. Apparently, witnessing our interaction prompted some serious internal discussions about their own networking and business development practices. What I didn't mention to Catherine, but what had been one of the most gratifying developments of the past 3 weeks, was the series of phone calls from other women who had been at the party. Patricia Williams had reached out to arrange a formal meeting about Innovate Tech's technology, but she had also shared her own experiences with being overlooked despite her senior position. Amanda Foster from marketing had called to apologize more thoroughly and to ask for advice about addressing similar issues within her own company. Most surprisingly, Linda Hayes from HR had requested a private meeting to discuss what she called institutional blind spots in Hartwell's networking and recruitment practices. Linda had explained that the evening had forced her to reconsider patterns she had observed but never actively addressed. She was now advocating for changes in how the company approached external partnerships and stakeholder engagement. The Wall Street Journal article appeared 2 weeks later with the headline, "When Networking Events Become Credibility Tests, How Unconscious Bias Shapes Business Relationships." Catherine had crafted a thoughtful piece that used my experience as a jumping-off point for a broader examination of how assumptions about age, gender, and appearance affected professional interactions in corporate America. The article quoted several other executives who shared similar experiences, creating a narrative that was about systemic issues rather than individual conflicts. Most importantly, it included responses from companies that were taking concrete steps to address these challenges, positioning the piece as constructive rather than merely critical. The response to the article exceeded anything I had anticipated. My inbox filled with messages from entrepreneurs, executives, and students who had experienced similar dismissive treatment in professional settings. Speaking requests arrived from business schools, industry conferences, and corporate diversity initiatives. Investment firms reached out to discuss potential partnerships, impressed by both our company's track record and the leadership qualities demonstrated in how we had handled a difficult situation. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the article appeared, I received a formal letter from the board of directors of Hartwell Industries, signed by the chairman himself, requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. The letter acknowledged that their previous approach to engaging with Innovate Tech had been inadequate and expressed genuine interest in exploring how our technology could address their operational challenges. The letter made no mention of Robert Mitchell, though industry gossip suggested he was now on thin ice with the board. Dad had mentioned during our weekly phone calls that Robert had been conspicuously absent from several high-level meetings, and that his technology modernization initiatives were being subjected to increased scrutiny. Jessica and I spent considerable time discussing whether to respond to Hartwell's overture. On one hand, they represented exactly the kind of large-scale client that could significantly accelerate our growth. Their operational challenges were complex and substantial, offering opportunities to demonstrate our technology's capabilities at the highest level. On the other hand, engaging with them risked appearing as though we were willing to overlook problematic behavior in exchange for business opportunities. Our decision was influenced by a conversation with Dr. Martinez, my former professor at Northwestern, who had become an informal advisor to Innovate Tech. She argued that true leadership sometimes required engaging with imperfect organizations in order to create positive change from within. You can maintain your principles while still working with people who are genuinely trying to improve, she said. The key is ensuring that your engagement actually drives meaningful change rather than just providing cover for cosmetic adjustments. We ultimately agreed to meet with Hartwell's board, but only under specific conditions. First, any partnership discussions would be conducted directly with board members and senior executives, bypassing the regional management structure that had created the initial problems. Second, we would require a formal commitment to inclusive partnership practices as part of any agreement. Third, we would maintain the right to share our experiences publicly, ensuring transparency about both successes and challenges. The meeting took place 3 weeks later in Hartwell's Chicago headquarters, in a conference room that offered sweeping views of Lake Michigan. The board had assembled their full technology committee, along with several senior operations executives who would be directly involved in any implementation. Notably absent was Robert Mitchell, though no one mentioned his absence explicitly. I arrived with Jessica and our head of enterprise development, Marcus Chen, Jessica's brother, who had joined the company 6 months earlier after completing his MBA at Wharton. The Hartwell team included 8 executives, led by board chairman William Hartwell himself, grandson of the company's founder, and someone whose reputation for straightforward dealing was legendary in Chicago business circles. Ms. Richardson, William said as we settled around the conference table, I want to begin by acknowledging that our initial approach to engaging with your company was unprofessional and inadequate. The board has conducted a thorough review of what happened at David's promotion party, and we take full responsibility for the failures in judgment and protocol that occurred. The apology was direct and unequivocal, delivered by someone whose authority within the organization was unquestioned. It set a tone for the meeting that was markedly different from my previous interactions with Hartwell representatives. We appreciate your acknowledgement, I replied. More importantly, we're interested in understanding what concrete changes you're implementing to ensure these issues don't recur with other potential partners. What followed was a detailed presentation about Hartwell's new partnership development protocols, including mandatory training for executives involved in external relationship building, structured evaluation processes for technology partnerships, and formal feedback mechanisms for external stakeholders. The changes were comprehensive and appeared to address the systemic issues that had led to the original problems. These initiatives are already showing results, explained Patricia Williams, who had been promoted to oversee all external partnership development. We've implemented these protocols with 3 other technology partnerships over the past month, and the feedback from those companies has been dramatically more positive than our previous approaches. The business discussion that followed was equally impressive. Hartwell's operations team had clearly done extensive research on Innovate Tech's capabilities and had identified specific areas where our technology could address their most pressing challenges. They presented detailed analyses of their supply chain inefficiencies, complete with cost projections and implementation timelines. Our preliminary assessment suggests that your predictive algorithms could reduce our supply chain disruptions by approximately 40%, while cutting inventory carrying costs by 25%, said Thomas Park, their chief operations officer. Based on our current operational scale, that translates to annual savings of roughly $60 million. The numbers were significant, representing the kind of impact that could establish Innovate Tech as a major player in the enterprise market. But more important than the financial projections was the quality of their analysis, which demonstrated genuine understanding of our technology and thoughtful consideration of implementation challenges. We're also interested in exploring opportunities beyond immediate operational improvements, William added. Hartwell is committed to becoming a leader in sustainable manufacturing practices, and we believe your technology could help us optimize resource utilization in ways that advance both efficiency and environmental goals. The sustainability angle was particularly appealing, aligning with Innovate Tech's broader mission of using artificial intelligence to create positive societal impact. We had been looking for opportunities to demonstrate how our technology could address environmental challenges, and Hartwell's manufacturing scale could provide an ideal platform for that work. By the end of the 3-hour meeting, we had outlined the framework for a comprehensive partnership that would begin with a pilot implementation in Hartwell's Midwest operations and potentially expand to their entire North American network. The financial terms were generous, the timeline was realistic, and the scope offered opportunities to push our technology in new directions. But perhaps most importantly, the meeting had demonstrated that organizations could learn from their mistakes and implement meaningful changes when leadership was committed to improvement. The contrast between this professional, respectful engagement and the dismissive treatment I had received at the promotion party was stark and encouraging. The formal partnership agreement was finalized 6 weeks later, following detailed technical evaluations and legal reviews. The announcement appeared in several industry publications, positioning the collaboration as a significant validation of AI-driven supply chain optimization and highlighting Innovate Tech's emergence as a major player in the enterprise market. The Wall Street Journal ran a follow-up piece about the partnership, with Catherine Morrison noting how our initial conflict with Hartwell had ultimately led to a more thoughtful and comprehensive business relationship. Richardson's experience demonstrates how addressing unconscious bias can create better outcomes for all parties involved, she wrote. Companies that learn to recognize and correct these patterns often discover opportunities they might otherwise have missed. The success of the Hartwell partnership opened doors throughout the manufacturing sector, as other companies sought to understand how AI technology could transform their operations. Innovate Tech's client roster expanded rapidly, with implementations across industries ranging from automotive manufacturing to food processing to pharmaceutical distribution. But the impact extended far beyond our business growth. The visibility generated by the Wall Street Journal coverage and the subsequent Hartwell partnership had established me as a recognized voice on issues of leadership and inclusion in technology. Speaking invitations arrived from major conferences, business schools began including our story in their case study curricula, and venture capital firms started citing our experience as an example of how diverse leadership could drive innovation and growth. 6 months after Dad's promotion party, I found myself standing on the stage at the annual National Supply Chain Conference in Las Vegas, the same event where I had first presented my graduate research 6 years earlier. This time, I was delivering the keynote address to an audience of over 2,000 logistics professionals, sharing insights about the intersection of artificial intelligence and supply chain management. But as I looked out at the audience, I realized that the most important part of my presentation wasn't the technical content about algorithms and predictive modeling. It was the story of how a moment of conflict had become a catalyst for positive change, demonstrating that standing up for principles could create value for everyone involved. Leadership isn't just about having the right ideas, I said, as I concluded my remarks. It's about having the courage to challenge assumptions that limit our collective potential. When we create environments where talent is recognized regardless of how it's packaged, we don't just solve individual problems. We unlock innovation that benefits entire industries. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but the conversations afterward were even more meaningful. Young professionals, seasoned executives, and industry veterans shared their own experiences with being underestimated or overlooked, and their strategies for creating more inclusive professional environments. A year later, Innovate Tech completed our Series C funding round, raising $45 million at a valuation that established us as one of the most successful AI companies outside of Silicon Valley. Forbes featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Algorithm Advantage: How Emma Richardson Built AI's Next Billion-Dollar Company." Harvard Business School developed a case study about our growth strategy and corporate culture, focusing on how inclusive leadership practices had contributed to our innovation capabilities. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't financial or professional recognition. It was the program Jessica and I had launched called Recognized, designed to help young professionals navigate unconscious bias in corporate environments. The program provided mentoring, networking opportunities, and strategic guidance for people who had been overlooked or underestimated in their careers. Recognized had grown from an idea born in a Chicago hotel room to a national initiative with chapters in 12 cities. We had helped hundreds of professionals develop strategies for advocating for themselves, and we had worked with dozens of companies to implement more inclusive networking and partnership practices. The program's success had attracted attention from major corporations, foundations, and academic institutions. We were invited to present our methodology at the World Economic Forum, and several business schools had integrated our frameworks into their leadership curricula. 2 years after that eventful evening at the Meridian Hotel, I was back in Chicago for the opening of Innovate Tech's new Midwest regional office. The location we had chosen was in the same downtown district as Hartwell Industries, and our partnership with them had been so successful that we were now implementing our technology across their entire global network. Dad joined me for the office opening ceremony, his pride evident as he toured the facilities that would employ over 50 people by the end of the year. Our relationship had deepened significantly since that night, when he had learned the true scope of my professional achievements. He had become one of Innovate Tech's most enthusiastic advocates within traditional manufacturing circles, and his insights about industry dynamics had proven invaluable as we expanded our enterprise client base. "You know," he said as we stood looking out at the Chicago skyline from our new office windows, "I've been thinking about that night at my promotion party. At the time, I was worried that the conflict with Robert might hurt your business prospects." "And now?" I asked, though I could guess what he was thinking. "Now I realize that standing up for yourself didn't just help your business. It helped a lot of other people too. I've seen the changes at Hartwell, the way people approach networking and partnerships differently now. Your willingness to call out problems created solutions that no one had imagined before." He was right, of course. What had started as a personal moment of conflict had rippled outward in ways that none of us had anticipated. Companies throughout the manufacturing sector had revised their partnership development practices. Business schools were teaching case studies about inclusive leadership. Young professionals had access to mentoring and support systems that hadn't existed before. The evening of our Chicago office opening, Jessica and I had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the river, reflecting on how far we had traveled from that night when I had been dismissed as someone's daughter, rather than recognized as a CEO in my own right. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just stayed quiet that night?" Jessica asked as we shared a bottle of wine and watched boats navigate the Chicago River below. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I think staying quiet would have been a betrayal of everyone who had been overlooked before me and everyone who would be overlooked after me. Sometimes the most important leadership decision is simply refusing to accept unacceptable behavior. Even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Change rarely happens when everyone is comfortable." As we walked back to our hotel that night, I thought about the young woman who had stood in a ballroom 2 years earlier, watching powerful people make assumptions about her worth based on superficial characteristics. That woman had possessed the technical skills and business acumen to build a successful company. But she had also needed to develop the confidence and strategic thinking required to challenge systems that undervalued people like her. The journey from that moment to this one had required constant learning, careful relationship building, and the kind of long-term vision that extended far beyond any individual business deal or professional achievement. It had meant choosing battles carefully, but fighting them with intelligence and determination when the stakes warranted the effort. Most importantly, it had meant recognizing that personal success without broader positive impact was ultimately hollow. The real measure of leadership wasn't just what you accomplished for yourself, but what you made possible for others who would follow in your footsteps. 3 years later, as I prepared to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange for Innovate Tech's initial public offering, I carried with me the lessons learned in that Chicago ballroom. The company we had built was worth over $1 billion, employed over 800 people across 4 countries, and was helping organizations around the world optimize their operations while reducing their environmental impact. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't reflected in our market valuation or our technology capabilities. It was the culture we had created, one where talent was recognized regardless of how it was packaged, where diverse perspectives drove innovation, and where standing up for principles was seen as a business advantage rather than a personal risk. As the opening bell rang and trading began, I thought about all the people who had contributed to this moment. Dad, whose unwavering support had given me the confidence to take risks. Jessica, whose strategic thinking and friendship had been essential to every major decision. Dr. Martinez, whose mentorship had launched my career. And even Robert Mitchell, whose dismissive behavior had inadvertently taught me the importance of never accepting treatment that diminished my potential. But mostly, I thought about the young professionals who would see our success and understand that being underestimated could become a source of strength rather than limitation. They would know that talent and determination could overcome bias and assumption, that standing up for principles could create value for everyone involved, and that the most powerful response to being overlooked was simply to prove the overlookers wrong. The story that had begun with a moment of conflict in a Chicago ballroom had become something much larger. Proof that individuals could drive systemic change, that inclusive leadership created better outcomes for everyone, and that sometimes the most important business decision was simply refusing to accept the unacceptable. As I watched Innovate Tech's stock price climb throughout that first day of trading, I realized that our success represented more than financial achievement. It represented the power of recognizing potential wherever it existed, the importance of creating opportunities for people who had been systematically overlooked, and the business value of building organizations that reflected the diversity of the markets they served. That evening, as I called Dad to share the excitement of our successful IPO, I could hear the pride in his voice as he congratulated me on an achievement that had exceeded both of our wildest expectations. "I always knew you were capable of great things," he said. "But I don't think even I imagined it would be this great." "It's not just about the company, Dad," I replied, looking out at the Manhattan skyline from my hotel room. "It's about proving that when you refuse to accept limitations that others try to impose on you, you don't just change your own trajectory. You change possibilities for everyone who comes after you." That was the real legacy of that night at the Meridian Hotel, when a young woman had been ignored and dismissed only to reveal herself as exactly the person those dismissive executives needed to take seriously. It wasn't just a story about business success or personal vindication. It was a story about the power of standing up for principles, the importance of recognizing potential wherever it existed, and the business value of creating environments where everyone could contribute their best work. Years later, when business schools taught case studies about Innovate Tech's growth and impact, they would focus on our technology innovations, our market strategy, and our financial performance. But the real lesson was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the most important leadership decision is simply refusing to be underestimated, and using that refusal as the foundation for building something better than what existed before. The morning after the confrontation at Dad's promotion party, I woke up in my hotel suite with a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't expected. The events of the previous evening had unfolded exactly as I had anticipated they would, though the emotional impact was still settling in my mind like sediment in still water. I had spent years preparing for moments like this, building not just a company but the confidence and strategic thinking necessary to navigate situations where my competence would be questioned or dismissed. What Robert Mitchell and the other Hartwell executives didn't realize was that their dismissive behavior had revealed far more about their company's culture and decision-making processes than any formal due diligence could have uncovered. I had essentially received a masterclass in organizational dysfunction, watching firsthand how unconscious bias affected everything from networking protocols to partnership development strategies. The intelligence I had gathered during those few hours would prove invaluable in ways that extended far beyond any single business relationship. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since 6 a.m. with messages from Jessica, who was staying at a different hotel but had clearly been processing the evening's events with the same analytical intensity that made her such an effective COO. Her texts revealed a mind working through multiple scenarios and strategic possibilities. Exactly the kind of thinking that had made our partnership so successful over the years. Coffee in the lobby in 20 minutes? Her latest message read, "I've been thinking about next steps and I have some ideas that might interest you." I smiled at her message, knowing that Jessica's ideas typically involved ambitious plans that pushed us into new territory. She had an intuitive understanding of how to transform challenging situations into strategic advantages, a skill that had been essential during Innovate Tech's rapid growth phase, when we were constantly navigating between startup agility and enterprise credibility. The hotel lobby was already bustling with business travelers when I arrived, the kind of polished professionals who populated Chicago's financial district. Jessica was waiting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she had been awake for hours thinking through complex scenarios. "So," she said without preamble as I sat down, "how do you want to play this?" "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I knew exactly what she was thinking. "I mean that what happened last night wasn't just a social misunderstanding or a business networking failure. It was a case study in how unconscious bias affects corporate decision-making at the highest levels. And we're in a unique position to do something meaningful about it." Jessica had always possessed an ability to see broader implications in specific situations, a talent that made her invaluable in strategic planning sessions. While I often focused on immediate tactical considerations, she naturally thought in terms of long-term impact and systemic change. "The way I see it," she continued, "we have several options. We can treat this as an isolated incident and move on with our business. We can use it as leverage to secure better terms in future partnership discussions. Or we can use it as a platform to address issues that affect not just us but countless other professionals who face similar challenges." I sipped my coffee, considering her words carefully. The third option was the most ambitious and potentially the most impactful, but it also carried the highest risks. Taking a public stand on issues of bias and inclusion could generate significant attention, but it could also create enemies in industries where traditional power structures remained firmly entrenched. "What would the platform approach look like?" I asked. "Media engagement, industry speaking opportunities, maybe even a formal initiative that helps other companies recognize and address these patterns in their own organizations. We've built enough credibility and success that people will listen to us. The question is whether we want to use that platform to drive broader change." The idea was appealing on multiple levels. Innovate Tech had reached a level of success that provided both the resources and the credibility necessary to tackle ambitious initiatives. Our technology was proven, our client base was growing rapidly, and our financial position was strong enough to absorb the risks associated with taking controversial positions on sensitive topics. More importantly, I had spent years watching talented people get overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit traditional expectations of what leadership looked like. The opportunity to address those systemic issues directly, using our success as evidence that diverse perspectives drove innovation and growth, felt like a natural evolution of everything we had been building. "There's something else to consider," Jessica said, lowering her voice slightly. "I've been watching industry trends, and there's a growing awareness that companies with diverse leadership teams consistently outperform their competitors. Forward-thinking organizations are actively looking for ways to improve their inclusion practices, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it drives better business results." She was right, of course. Research from consulting firms like McKinsey and BCG had demonstrated clear correlations between diversity and financial performance. And progressive companies were beginning to treat inclusion as a competitive advantage rather than just a compliance requirement. The timing for our message couldn't have been better. "What about the risks?" I asked. "Taking public positions on these issues could alienate potential clients who prefer to avoid controversial topics." "That's true," Jessica admitted. "But I think we need to ask ourselves what kind of clients we want to work with. Do we want partnerships with organizations that see inclusion as controversial, Or do we want to work with companies that recognize diverse perspectives as essential for innovation? The question crystallized something I had been thinking about throughout Innovate Tech's growth. We had always been selective about our client relationships, prioritizing companies that shared our values and approached technology implementation thoughtfully. Expanding that selectivity to include organizational culture and leadership practices felt like a natural extension of our existing approach. Plus, Jessica continued, the clients we would lose probably aren't the ones we want anyway. Companies that dismiss people based on demographics rather than qualifications are exactly the kind of organizations that struggle with innovation and adaptation. They're not our ideal partners. As we discussed the possibilities, I found myself thinking about the young professionals who would face similar challenges in their own careers. How many talented people were being overlooked because they didn't fit traditional expectations? How many innovative ideas were being dismissed because they came from unexpected sources? The opportunity to address these issues directly felt like both a responsibility and an opportunity. All right, I said finally, let's explore the platform approach. But we need to be strategic about it. This can't be about personal grievances or attacking specific individuals. It has to be about systemic issues and constructive solutions. Jessica's smile indicated that she had been hoping for exactly that response. I've already been thinking about potential messaging and outreach strategies. The key is positioning this as a business competitiveness issue, rather than just a social justice initiative. Over the next 2 hours, we outlined a comprehensive approach that would use the previous evening's events as a launching point for broader conversations about inclusion and leadership in corporate America. The strategy involved multiple elements: targeted media engagement to share our story and its implications, speaking opportunities at industry conferences and business schools, and eventually a formal program to help other companies improve their networking and partnership practices. The media component would begin with carefully selected business journalists who specialized in leadership and organizational culture topics. Rather than seeking sensational coverage, we would focus on thoughtful publications that could explore the business implications of unconscious bias and the competitive advantages of inclusive practices. The speaking opportunities would allow us to share our experiences directly with business leaders, students, and industry professionals who could implement changes in their own organizations. By focusing on practical strategies and measurable outcomes, we could move beyond theoretical discussions to actionable insights that drove real improvement. The formal program would be the most ambitious element, requiring significant investment of time and resources, but offering the greatest potential for systemic impact. We envisioned workshops, assessment tools, and consulting services that would help organizations identify blind spots in their current practices and implement more effective approaches to talent recognition and partnership development. What should we call it? Jessica asked as we refined our plans. How about recognized? I suggested. It captures both the problem and the solution. People want to be recognized for their contributions, and organizations need to get better at recognizing talent wherever it exists. The name felt right immediately, encompassing both the personal validation that everyone sought and the business imperative for companies to identify and leverage diverse capabilities. It also had the advantage of being positive and aspirational, rather than critical or confrontational. By the time we left the hotel for our flight back to Austin, we had transformed the previous evening's conflict into the foundation for a comprehensive initiative that could drive meaningful change across multiple industries. The excitement I felt about the possibilities was tempered by awareness of the challenges ahead, but I had learned throughout Innovate Tech's growth that ambitious goals required ambitious thinking. The flight back to Austin provided additional time to refine our strategy and consider implementation details. Jessica had already begun reaching out to her network of business journalists, testing interest in stories about unconscious bias and its impact on corporate innovation. The initial responses were encouraging, suggesting that our timing aligned with broader industry conversations about leadership and inclusion. I spent the flight reviewing Innovate Tech's current project portfolio and resource allocation, considering how much bandwidth we could dedicate to the recognized initiative without compromising our core business operations. We had built the company by maintaining intense focus on client satisfaction and product development, and any new initiatives needed to complement rather than compete with those priorities. The answer, I realized, was to approach recognized as an extension of our existing expertise rather than a separate venture. Many of the skills that made Innovate Tech successful in technology implementation, systems thinking, change management, data-driven decision-making, were directly applicable to organizational culture initiatives. We could leverage our established credibility to drive conversations about inclusion, while demonstrating how diverse perspectives enhanced innovation capabilities. Our first major opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days after returning to Austin, I received a call from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the dean of the business school at University of Texas. She had heard about our experience at the Hartwell event through mutual connections and was interested in having me speak at their upcoming Leadership Innovation Conference. "Emma, I think your story touches on issues that our students and alumni need to understand," Dr. Rodriguez said during our phone conversation. "But more importantly, I think you've demonstrated practical strategies for addressing these challenges that could help other professionals navigate similar situations." The speaking opportunity was exactly the kind of platform we had been hoping for, offering access to current and future business leaders who could implement inclusive practices in their own organizations. I accepted immediately, knowing that the University of Texas event would provide an ideal testing ground for our messaging and approach. Preparing for the presentation forced me to articulate clearly what had happened at the Hartwell event and why it mattered beyond my personal experience. I needed to connect specific incidents to broader patterns, demonstrating how unconscious bias affected business outcomes in measurable ways. Most importantly, I needed to offer practical solutions that audience members could implement in their own professional contexts. The research phase of my preparation proved fascinating and illuminating. Academic studies had documented extensive evidence that diverse teams consistently outperformed homogeneous groups on complex problem-solving tasks. Companies with diverse leadership showed higher rates of innovation, better financial performance, and improved risk management capabilities. The business case for inclusion was overwhelming, yet implementation remained inconsistent across most industries. The disconnect between research evidence and practical implementation suggested that the problem wasn't awareness but execution. Most business leaders understood intellectually that diversity drove better results, but many organizations struggled to translate that understanding into effective policies and practices. This was exactly the gap that Recognized could help address. My presentation at the UT Leadership Conference took place in a packed auditorium with over 400 attendees, including current students, alumni, faculty, and local business leaders. As I looked out at the audience, I realized that this was my first opportunity to share our story with a large group and gauge reactions to our broader message. 2 weeks ago, I began, I attended a corporate networking event where I was consistently dismissed and ignored, despite being the CEO of a successful technology company. What made this particularly interesting was that the dismissive treatment came from executives at a company that desperately needed the exact solutions my company provides. I walked the audience through the events of that evening, being careful to focus on patterns rather than personalities. I explained how assumptions based on age and gender had prevented meaningful professional engagement, and how those same assumptions had led to embarrassing mistakes by senior executives who thought they understood situations they had never bothered to investigate properly. The immediate impact was a missed business opportunity, I continued. But the broader implications extend far beyond any single partnership. When organizations systematically overlook talent because it doesn't match their expectations, they compromise their own competitive capabilities. The audience was engaged and attentive, with many people taking notes and several nodding in recognition. During the question and answer session, I heard from students who had experienced similar dismissive treatment during internships and networking events, alumni who had observed these patterns in their own companies, and business leaders who wanted to understand how to improve their organization's practices. One question came from a senior executive at a major Austin technology company. How do we move beyond awareness to actual implementation? Most of our leadership team understands these issues intellectually, but we struggle to change embedded organizational behaviors. The question was exactly what I had been hoping for, providing an opportunity to introduce the recognized concept and gauge interest in formal programming. That's precisely why we're developing a comprehensive initiative to help organizations implement inclusive practices systematically, I replied. Awareness is important, but behavior change requires structured approaches, measurement systems, and ongoing reinforcement. The response to my presentation exceeded my expectations, with numerous attendees approaching me afterward to continue the conversation. Business school professors wanted to incorporate our case study into their curricula. Local executives requested follow-up meetings to discuss potential consulting engagements. Students asked for mentoring and career advice, having recognized parallels between my experiences and their own challenges. Most significantly, I received an invitation from the Austin Business Journal to participate in a panel discussion about women in technology leadership, scheduled for the following month. The panel would include several other successful female entrepreneurs and would be covered by business media throughout Texas. The momentum continued building over the following weeks, as word about our story spread through business networks and professional associations. Jessica's media outreach efforts had generated interest from several national business publications, and we were beginning to receive speaking invitations from conferences and corporate events around the country. But the most meaningful response came from unexpected sources. Other professionals who had experienced similar dismissive treatment and wanted to share their own stories. My inbox filled with messages from people across industries who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because they didn't fit traditional expectations of what leadership looked like. Reading these messages was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because they revealed how widespread these patterns were across virtually every industry and organizational level. Inspiring because they demonstrated the talent and determination that existed among people who had been systematically undervalued by traditional corporate structures. One message particularly stood out, from a woman named Sarah Chen who worked as an engineer at a major aerospace company. "I've been trying to get my ideas heard for 3 years," she wrote. "Management treats me like I'm there to take notes and fetch coffee, even though I have patents in propulsion technology. Your story gave me the courage to escalate my concerns to senior leadership." Another came from Marcus Williams, a young African-American consultant who had experienced similar dismissive treatment at client meetings despite his extensive expertise in financial modeling. "I thought I was imagining the patterns," he wrote. "Seeing someone with your success call out these behaviors publicly made me realize I wasn't crazy." The messages convinced me that recognized needed to move beyond academic discussions to practical support for individuals facing these challenges. We began developing mentoring components, networking opportunities, and strategic guidance resources that could help people navigate bias while building successful careers. The Austin Business Journal panel discussion took place at the Four Seasons Hotel downtown, with an audience of over 300 local business leaders and entrepreneurs. The format was informal but structured, allowing each panelist to share insights about building companies and leading teams in technology industries. When the moderator asked about challenges we had faced as female leaders, I saw an opportunity to introduce recognized concepts to a new audience. One of the most persistent challenges is what I call credibility taxation, I said. The additional effort required to prove competence and earn respect that would be automatically granted to others. The phrase resonated immediately with other panelists, who began sharing their own experiences with having to work harder to achieve the same recognition that male colleagues received automatically. The conversation evolved into a broader discussion about systemic barriers and practical strategies for addressing them. "The key insight," I continued, "is that these aren't just individual challenges. They're organizational inefficiencies that prevent companies from leveraging their full talent potential. When we address bias systematically, everyone benefits." The panel discussion generated significant media coverage, with articles appearing in business publications throughout Texas and beyond. More importantly, it established my credibility as a thought leader on inclusion and leadership topics, opening doors to additional speaking opportunities and consulting engagements. 3 months after the Hartwell Industries promotion party, Recognized had evolved from a strategic response to personal conflict into a comprehensive platform for driving organizational change. We had received consulting inquiries from over 20 companies, speaking invitations from major conferences, and media attention from national business publications. The program's first formal client was ironically appropriate, a mid-sized manufacturing company in Dallas that had heard about our work through industry networks and wanted help improving their networking and partnership practices. The company's CEO had acknowledged that their leadership team struggled to recognize talent that didn't fit traditional profiles, and they wanted strategic guidance for implementing more inclusive approaches. The consulting engagement provided an opportunity to test our methodologies and refine our approach based on real-world implementation challenges. Working with the Dallas company taught us valuable lessons about change management, measurement systems, and ongoing reinforcement strategies that would inform all subsequent recognized programming. 6 months later, when I received a formal invitation to speak at the National Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., I realized that the evening at Dad's promotion party had become something much larger than a personal confrontation. It had become the catalyst for a movement that was helping organizations recognize and leverage talent more effectively, while providing support for individuals facing similar challenges. The young woman who had been dismissed as someone's daughter in a Chicago ballroom had become a recognized voice on leadership and inclusion in corporate America. But more importantly, that transformation was creating opportunities for countless other people who had been overlooked or underestimated based on demographics rather than capabilities. Standing backstage before my presentation at the National Leadership Summit, I reflected on the journey from that moment of conflict to this platform for change. The path had required strategic thinking, careful relationship building, and the courage to speak truth to power when the stakes warranted the effort. But the most important lesson was that individual success without broader positive impact was ultimately hollow. The real measure of leadership wasn't just what you accomplished for yourself, but what you made possible for others who would follow in your footsteps. As I walked onto the stage to address an audience of over 2,000 business leaders, I carried with me the voices of everyone who had shared their stories of being overlooked or dismissed. Their experiences had taught me that the most powerful response to being underestimated was not just proving the estimates wrong, but using that proof to create better systems for recognizing talent wherever it existed. The presentation went exceptionally well, generating standing ovations and extensive media coverage. But the real success was measured in the conversations that followed. As business leaders committed to implementing inclusive practices in their own organizations, and young professionals found the courage to advocate for themselves in challenging situations. That evening, as I called Dad to share the day's success, I could hear the pride in his voice as he congratulated me on achievements that had exceeded both of our expectations. "I always knew you were capable of great things," he said, "but I don't think even I imagined you would use your success to help so many other people." "That's the point, Dad," I replied, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline from my hotel room. Success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about using whatever platform you build to create opportunities for others who might not otherwise have them. The real legacy of that night at the Meridian Hotel wasn't just business success or personal vindication. It was the recognition that when talented people refuse to accept limitations imposed by others, they don't just change their own trajectories. They create possibilities for everyone who faces similar challenges. Years later, when business schools taught case studies about inclusive leadership and organizational change, they would focus on research data and implementation strategies. But the real lesson was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the most important leadership decision is refusing to be underestimated, and using that refusal as the foundation for building something better than what existed before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.